We're moving through election season around the world, and tax rises are always a hot topic. One tax subject that just will not go away is that we need to tax the billionaires more. And on face value, this is a good idea. Governments everywhere spend more than they bring in from taxes, so they need to raise more money. Billionaires have the most money. But there's a lot more to it than that. Even if you think this is a good idea, it might not actually raise the kind of money people think it will. So we're going to take a look at just how bad the UK's finances really are, how much an additional tax on billionaires might raise, how much HMRC thinks billionaires dodge taxes by, and how much the wealthiest in the country currently pay in taxes. Now, if you're watching elsewhere in the world, this does translate really well to other developed economies. This is your full context on taxing billionaires. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim. I trained as a chartered accountant at some of the biggest firms in the world and worked in senior finance positions at a variety of different businesses. I retired at 33 and now I work as an investor and make videos explaining things that I get asked about the most. Before we start, we need to understand what the current state of the UK public finances are. We currently spend around 1.2 trillion a year on a variety of public services. We're not going to be criticising today what we actually spend the money on, but the fact that there are two other buckets for a total of £500 billion in an official OBR document is in itself entirely unhelpful. We raise a little over 1.1 trillion from income tax, VAT and corporation tax, but also a variety of other taxes that you can see here. You notice that we raise less than we spend, and the country effectively has a loss every year of 87 billion, and this is called the budget deficit. Because we don't have a lot of money to pay for everything we want, we will either print or borrow the money. And if we borrow money, well, that means we go into debt. Now, barring a couple of exceptions, the UK has spent more than it's raised pretty much every year for the last 50 years, meaning that the debt is getting bigger and bigger every single year. You may have noticed that part of our spending is debt interest. This is the interest we spend every year to service the huge amount of debt that the country has. This is basically the interest we have to pay on our borrowings. Not only is this bigger than the budget deficit, i.e. if we didn't have to pay the interest, we wouldn't be losing money at all, but it's also bigger than the education budget and bigger than the police and fire service budgets combined. We should also remember that interest rates were at an all-time low for 15 years, and our interest payments will continue to grow over time now that interest rates are higher. Not to mention the fact that our debt will keep growing. The declared debt level at the moment is 2.6 trillion and expected to keep rising. But that's more than double our revenue each year and the equivalent of almost £100,000 per household. But this is just the loans that the central government has in the form of gilts and bonds, and it does not include the local government debt owned by regional councils, estimated to be a further 95 billion. In addition, there's also a host of public sector pension schemes, the largest of which are from the NHS, the civil service, the teachers' pension, and also the armed forces pension schemes. Combined, they account for around 75% of all the central government spending on pensions, and we can use that to approximate the central government pension debt at around £2 trillion. Which means that we take the total debt level of the country to around 4.7 trillion. Now, some of you might be wondering why pension scheme obligations exist. You're supposed to pay into a pension scheme, your employer pays in, and the scheme invests your money. And even if you have a defined benefit or final salary pension scheme for your retirement, schemes are supposed to make sure that the employer pays in more to ensure that the scheme is never underfunded and is always able to pay the pensions that it owns. Well, this is completely the opposite of how these schemes work, which basically just have an IOU from the Prime Minister and that they promise you'll get your pension in the future. The money you put into your pension every year just goes into the government coffers. You're not hearing me wrong. If you pay into a central government pension scheme, you are entirely at the will of future governments to ensure you are paid. Now, before I get any accountants or actuaries at me in the comments, I should say that estimating pension scheme obligations is very difficult and involves a ridiculous amount of estimation. In reality, these obligations could be much, much higher or much lower. But they have been assessed by a qualified actuary in a standardised way and is a reasonable best guess. If you're interested to know more about how you work out pension scheme liabilities, let me know in the comments and I might do a video on it. Now, for the sake of full context, I do need to give one final caveat, which is that I haven't included all of the public sector debt here. I didn't want to collect information on the size of all the deficits or possibly surpluses in all of the local government pension schemes, when it doesn't really affect the context that we're talking about here, but know that this is one rabbit hole that you could go down. So now that we understand the state of the government finances, let's talk billionaires. The Sunday Times releases a list every year compiling the richest people in the UK. This doesn't include everything that they might own, but it is a reasonable estimate of their wealth. And this has 165 billionaires with a combined total wealth of 672 billion. So let's say we imposed a 100% wealth tax on billionaires. I know this is unrealistic, but just go with me for a minute. We know that our annual spending is over 1.2 trillion. So if we were to just take all of their money, that would run the country for about 6 months. Alternatively, we could just reduce some of our debt, but only by around 15%. So the wealth of billionaires is such a small amount compared to the government spending and government debt. Furthermore, if we did take their wealth, we would no longer be able to get the tax income from them in the future. Instead of milking the cows on our farm for years, we killed them for one slap-up meal, and we are now left with no milk down the line. I can hear you screaming at me now. Tim, billionaires do not pay tax. They dodge all their taxes. Well, every year HMRC actually compiles a report on the tax gap. The tax gap is the difference between what HMRC think we should have collected in tax and what we actually collected. The tax gap is around £40 billion, which is about 5% of all the tax receipts. But HMRC breaks it down not only by the type of tax, but also by who they think the offenders are. So we can see that income tax is consistently the largest type of tax, with corporation tax and VAT in second and third. What's interesting is that this is dominated by small businesses, who are by far the biggest perpetrators. This is certainly as a result of undeclared cash-in-hand transactions, which would be potentially evading all three taxes. Honestly, even though this looks surprising, it really shouldn't be. Whilst there is clearly a huge amount of wealth concentrated in the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and indeed the top 100 wealthiest people, it's not huge when you compare it to the estimated wealth of the entire country. The Office for National Statistics compiles data to estimate the net worth of the country's individuals and most recently estimated 11.8 trillion, meaning that the 165 billionaires with a combined total wealth of 672 billion account for around 5% of the total wealth. Because of this wealth distribution, you certainly wouldn't expect a smaller portion of the wealth to contribute to a higher percentage of the tax gap. Now, I don't want to come across like I'm okay with the huge wealth divide. It's crazy that 135 billionaires or billionaire families own 5% of all the wealth in this country. But it's not right to say that the billionaires not paying tax is the reason the country can't spend more on its public services. Separate and slightly older ONS studies showed that the wealthiest 10% of individuals hold almost half of all the wealth. However, they point out that the demographics that dominate this top decile, mostly being close or at retirement age, is the best indicator of wealth. Having had your entire working life to save, pay off your house, and invest is the best indicator of wealth in this country. On average, 50% of their wealth is from pensions and 30% is from their house. This is not dominated by the extreme wealth of multimillionaires and billionaires, rather just people who have saved aggressively into their pension and into their house for many years. Though clearly, the mean average being higher than the median average shows that there remains a disparity in every age group. And even more important than that, my subscriber count is a long way from being a millionaire. If you're liking this video, please like and subscribe. I also need to point out how much tax the wealthiest actually pay. Even if HMRC don't think they're underpaying, do we collectively think they should be paying more? Well, there is a really good report a few months ago highlighting a number of key tax statistics. Firstly, let's look at how much income tax the wealthiest pay. The top 1% of earners are earning 12.5% of all the income. And whilst there is a disparity here, they are paying nearly 30% of all the income tax. And this is increasing. 20 years ago, the top 10% paid around 50% of all the income tax, and today the top 10% pay 60% of all the income tax. Which also kind of makes sense, because we know from earlier that the top 10% have 50% of all the wealth, so I guess it kind of makes sense that they should pay 50% of the tax. We could also see that the top 50% pay over 90% of all the income tax receipts. How does this measure up with other taxes? Well, it's certainly not so top heavy as income tax, but the top 10% of households pay around 30% of all taxes, and the top 50% of households pay 80% of all taxes. Now, I've managed to make the point that not only do the wealthiest in society pay by far the most in tax, but their wealth is not so great as to eclipse the wealth of the entire country. A tax on billionaires does not provide some sort of silver bullet to better fund our public services, and this chart from HMRC sums it up really well. An increase to the additional rate of tax, what you pay after £150,000 a year, by 1 pence or 1 percentage point, would raise almost nothing by comparison to an increase in the basic rate paid by all taxpayers. This is because the collective wealth, earnings, and power of the population is so much greater than the top 1% alone. But there are a few things that I have intentionally left out of the story so far. When we spoke about the tax gap and how HMRC is not expecting huge uncollected sums from large businesses and wealthy people, that is, at least in part, due to the fact that HMRC expects some of these big businesses and wealthy people to legally avoid and pay less in tax. This could be taking advantage of government schemes to encourage investment, making payments to your parent company in a low tax territory like Luxembourg, or a host of other things. And there is really no good measure to know how much tax may be lost to perfectly legal tax avoidance schemes that the public might adjudge to be morally disagreeable. But what I can say is that there is typically a multitude of ways to delay paying tax. Often these are on purpose, to encourage you to spend or invest. Think about paying into your pension scheme. That is a very good and legal way to avoid tax. But there are far fewer ways to legally avoid ever paying income tax on an income or asset sale. My personal speculation is that even this morally dubious avoidance would only be a relatively small amount in the scale of our income tax and budget deficit. Simply taxing the ultra-rich will not deal with the problems of our public finances. The wealth and incomes of the combined masses is simply much greater than a small number of people at the top. We need to have proper conversations with each other about how we pay for the ever-increasing public services budgets, and also be honest about whether or not we're really getting good value for them. Over the last 20 years, public services have had greater and greater budgets, more and more money, but most would say that the standard of service is only going down. So instead of listening to the rhetoric, wonder if, maybe, there is something else that can be done, or perhaps we can do things differently. Contrary to what we're often told, we cannot continue to borrow and grow our national debt forever. Eventually there will be much less to borrow, the cost of borrowing will increase, and we will print more money and inflation will simply erode our wealth. Let me know what you think in the comments. That was your full context on taxing billionaires.